this is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.
Lowe's knows Sundays are for football, so tackle your home improvement projects by Saturday and earn your Sunday with great deals on LG and Bosch appliances, select Bounty and Swiffer cleaning products, and more. Then once your to-do list is done, get ready to kick back, relax, and enjoy the game. Shop in store or online now and earn your Sunday with help from Lowe's, official partner of the NFL.
You know how it's never really about where you're going, it's about who you're going with? The right people can turn any drive into a great memory. That's something Toyota really believes. They design vehicles around real life and real people, the ones who make plans happen and bring everyone together. Inside, everything's built with passengers in mind. Comfortable seating, smart layouts, and space that actually works so everyone can relax and enjoy the ride. There's room for the people, room for the stuff, and room for the moments that happen along the way. Because when people are the destination, your ride is important. Learn more at Toyota.com and find the vehicle that fits your people.
This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 1092 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast. Thanks for tuning in. Last week, I chatted with Alfredo Brown about this year's quarterback class. Today, we're digging into running backs. If you've been reading about the draft, you probably know this isn't the best running back class in the world, but we're still bound to get some usability from it. To help me dissect this class, I chatted with my friend Jeff Bell of Footballguys. We discussed Jeremiyah Love's elite ability, some potential RB2 candidates in the class, later round darts, and so much more. Now, before we get into that interview, I just need to send another reminder. Check out the Late Round Prospect Guide. It's 170 pages of analytical information about this class, and it includes info on second-year players as well, all for $19.99. If you purchase now, you'll also get the post-draft version of the guide emailed to you just hours after the NFL draft is over. Check it all out over on lateround.com. Now, here's my interview with Mr. Jeff Bell. All right, Jeff, talk to me about your general process for prospect evaluation. Like, how do you mix in film work? I know you look at least a little bit of analytics and stuff too, and you've done a lot of work, with prospecting in general. But what is your evaluation process like, so that while we dig into this running back class, people kind of have that background?
Yeah, I think that when looking overall, and I know your audience leans a little bit more on the analytical side, I think that's really looking for disqualifiers probably on the analytical side, and as opposed to qualifiers is where I would come down on that side. But I'm a film watcher. I mean, I'm a film watcher at heart. My uncle was a wide receiver coach. I did all the wide receivers for the guide and the Footballguys rookie guide this year, and did about 57 wide receivers. And so really just stacking it up, watching everything that I can find and working through. And when it comes to wide receiver evaluation and some level at running back evaluation as well, just looking at what role they will fill and kind of, do they move like an NFL player? Do they high level explosion? Do they have those things that are qualifiers? And really, I'm going through the process. I'm trying to look hard for what can a player do? How can they profile into it? That's what it comes down to. A lot of it. I'm in the middle of the scouting academy right now, and so going through that curriculum to kind of sharpen that film watcher view of it. But that is really where I lie. I'm a CPA, and so the numbers are my life. And so kind of scouting, when it comes down to it, is like I like the tape side of a little bit more. Exercise a different part of my brain than what I run into quite a lot through the day to day.
Yeah, I was going to say, it seems like is it, do you think that you're doing that on purpose in a way, almost subconsciously, of like a way of like just doing something different than what your day to day generally is, with you just looking at numbers all day long?
I think that might be part of it. Certainly that might be part of it. And I do think at some level, we're all just trying to figure out what is most comfortable for us, but also fill in what's least comfortable for us. Right, and so somebody that's very, very high, strong on the analytical side, maybe they don't feel as comfortable on the tape watching side. And so they're using the proxy to try to fill it in. I know it's kind of, that's the view on, I hate to bring them up, they're in the news right now, but the PFF grades coming through and kind of using that as a proxy for film watching. I think that's when it comes down to we lean on our strengths and we try to fill in our gaps where we could get stronger. And it is probably part of my brain when it comes down to it, of wanting to have the more creative side that watches and kind of exercise that relative to looking at numbers quite a bit as a CPA.
Yeah. I mean, it's good to be well-rounded and have that background. So it's awesome. All right, let's talk about this running back class. Jeremiyah Love right now is the consensus RB1. I would assume you agree that he's the RB1 in this class, but talk to me about how high you think his ceiling could be, in fantasy, especially. And how do you think he compares? I've asked this to a lot of folks that have come on. Now, I think that, like, at the end of the day, are we really making this super actionable? Probably not, because it's like, okay, it's Jeremiyah Love. He's the RB1. What more can we go? Like, we know where we're drafting him, generally speaking. But I do think it's important and interesting to kind of compare him to the other elite backs that have come out recently to see if you do see there being a big gap, or maybe you don't see there being a big gap. So how do you view Love? How elite is his ceiling? And is he as good as some of the other backs that have come out, in the first round in recent memory?
I think he's right there with the other backs that we've seen, with having Ashton Jeanty in the class last year, having Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan Robinson in 2 classes prior to that. And that's really, when it comes down to the backs that have come out recently, that's kind of the high-end backs that we've seen recently. And so I think Love does have, and a lot of it, and I'm excited to dive into just the running back position with you in general, but I know we've talked a little bit in the past about the way that the NFL is kind of changing the shape of having multiple tight end involvement, kind of taking a wide receiver off the field, and the shape of the running back position, I think, has changed quite a bit in terms of looking more for 3-down skill sets and having the ability to kind of ease maybe the workload of what used to be more of a strict committee approach. Now teams don't want to tip their hand. They want to keep the same players on the field. And I think really at the end of the day, that's where Love comes into it. He's a 3-down back, much in the same skill set that Jahmyr Gibbs is a 3-down back in the NFL. And so I think that without question, I think he clears that bar. But it's, we're coming off of what has been traditionally viewed as that 3-down back profile, but James Cook led the league in rushing. And that was a player that we never would have thought, and especially in the prospect phase of it, that he had the profile to be a guy that leads the NFL in rushing. I think when we were kids, it was like the big Gilbert Brown inside and those guys falling on you. Those guys had kind of disappeared out of the game. There's more space now, and they've both been mitigation of what the hits the running backs are taking, awareness probably on what you're putting on the running backs. It does feel like we're in a period of 3-down backs, and I think Jeremiyah Love does have that.
Yeah, I think that it's really important to recognize and to think about sort of how teams are using and deploying their running backs, and that, I think the teams should use more workhorses personally, but even if they don't, look at what the Rams are doing, where instead of thinking about using a running back only on, early downs, then only on 3rd downs, you rotate by drive, right? And you have, when they drafted Blake Corum or even Jarquez Hunter, who didn't get, run last year, it's the same archetype of running back and size and style of back that they could hypothetically just be rotating in and out and not lose, a beat, offensively. And I do think that there is value in a player like Love, being able to not show their hand because he is a 3-down back and he has the skill set as a receiver. He has a skill set, obviously, to create explosive runs, to do stuff at the goal line. I mean, he can do it all. And I do think that, do I think that a team needs to spend a top 10 pick on him? Probably not, from an economic standpoint, whatever the case may be. But I get the value side of it more. Like, I think that there is an untapped or not talked about that much value in having a player that is not leaving the field in general, right? Like, we can't discount that totally. So I think it's a really, really important piece to bring up with the Love evaluation. Now, he shared a backfield in college with Jadarian Price. And I have a hard time with Jadarian Price because his production profile is understandably not very strong. And then there were things that happened, like at the combine, for instance, where he weighed less than I expected him to weigh. He didn't run as fast as I expected him to run. Now, I'm not like, hey, you got to crush the combine or else I'm not going to like you as a player. Like, it's not like that, but it's more so, he had a good explosive run rate, but then, the metrics the measurables didn't necessarily line up to that. It's just a really tough evaluation for me. So tell me, how do you feel about Jadarian Price?
I hear you on being a tough evaluation, but then at the same time, we're seeing a lot of, in this class, we have the two Penn State running backs. In last year's class, we have the Ohio State running backs with Judkins and Travion Henderson. And so I think we're seeing, given, and this is what is really interesting. And part of it's like the analytics conversation around, just in general, of historic benchmarks seem to be completely out the window in many regards because of this era that we're in now in college football with NIL, with player mobility, the transfer portal, all of this. And you're seeing almost the opposite of what you think you would see, because you think that these running backs want to be the guy. They want to go somewhere that they can, and it's the opposite. These guys just want to get to the NFL on some level. They know that they're going to get paid. And so like Quinshon Judkins and Travion Henderson don't have a problem sharing a backfield together because they know that they're going to go to the NFL. And so I think it's really, really interesting, just the historically what we're looking at. And I hear you absolutely on production profile not being there for Jadarian Price. At some level, we're just making the bet on him being the athlete that the NFL wants to see in the position, and him having that upside, having the assumption that had he been at 115 other schools, he would be the top running back at that school is part of where we're landing there. And some of it's just the muck of this just class in general is definitely part of it as well. Yeah. But I think it is an interesting conversation. And it's one that, as we go through that journey of like, you kind of put your prospecting cap on and you start to put out content, you start to do those things. I feel like it's very easy to think of the process as being very difficult. But one of the things that I go back to quite a bit is Adam Harston's one of the smartest people that I know. And Adam Harston, great job of dynasty content over at Footballguys, but I really enjoyed just talking to Adam, and his view on rookies. He basically doesn't have a view on rookies. He just takes the guys that get draft capital because he says the NFL is right, like more often than trying to project this guy should have gone over here. And so at some level, it's your rookie drafts after the NFL draft. And I think the running back position in general, you're looking for landing spots, you're looking for opportunity, and you're waiting for the NFL to tell you that Jadarian Price is a day 2 pick and he lands somewhere, he lands in Seattle or something like that. Then we're like, well, we don't really care about these profiles. He lands in Seattle where it looks like a wide open and a good offense, and he's on day 2. Like, let's go with it.
Yeah. I mean, that is honestly like the hardest thing for me with Price in particular, is that I'm just waiting for him to get drafted by Seattle and to then have this internal battle, the night that the draft ends, or, I guess it would be the Friday night when he gets drafted, and me thinking about where am I going to rank this guy in the next 24 hours before the prospect guide goes out again to the people who had the pre-draft version and they want the post-draft version. And it just wrecking my brain, because on one hand, it's like, yes, that is what we need to do, right? But then on the other hand, you're like, okay, but there's this and there's that. And then with Price, where it's different is that there's at least this excuse hanging there, right? Like analytically, the hard part for me, and I want to ask you about this too, like the hard part for me about Price is obviously analytically, it's not fully there, but if he goes day 2, he's already kind of an outlier because of how bad his analytical profile already is, right? Like I'm talking like 3rd percentile best season reception share. Like he was not used much at all, but there's an obvious reason as to why that happened. So my thing is I'm trying to figure out if people believe who are watching this and not doing as much of the analytical work, but maybe approaching it from a different angle, if they see at least like a pass catching ceiling for him, because I don't really question the early down stuff to a degree. I don't know how big of a workload he can carry. Don't get me wrong, like, because we didn't really see that, but I do think that he can be an explosive runner because a lot of those metrics line up with really good explosive run rate, etc. He looks good there. The big question I have is people have questioned his pass pro, and then they've questioned a little bit his pass catching ability. I want to hear what you think about that. And then my sort of like response is that if the pass catching isn't there, then that actually is going to probably get me more off of Price, assuming that his ADP would rise if he gets really good draft capital, if he lands in Seattle, all that kind of stuff. Because I want the pass, like I still want a pass catching back, a guy who's going to be deployed that way. So do you have concerns on that end at all? As like a receiver, as a pass protector, any of that stuff?
So part of, the analytics, just like, no matter what your approach is if it's not there, what's the story? Why is it not there? And I
Right.
think that the one thing with Price is it's when Riley Leonard's the quarterback at Notre Dame, and like they've got Riley Leonard scrambling around and playing his best Tim Tebow impression, but you're also sharing a backfield with Jeremiyah Love. It's easy to understand and see why it's not there potentially. And so I think that that's probably the argument for the out if you're in on Price. Of you can see a very, very clear reason why it's not there. It's the Ohio State argument again, where it's Quinshon Judkins is not involved in the passing game because Travion Henderson is a very good at pass pro, and then he gets to the NFL and now Travion Henderson apparently can't pass pro, even though he looked like one of the better pass pro prospects coming in. What's the argument for it not being there if it's not there? And I think that's probably where it lands on Price. And again, what does he get asked to do? What does he get fitted into? Does he get into a situation where, you can look at Jacksonville and having Bishal Tootin, and then LaQuinn Allen gets drafted way after Bishal Tootin, but then LaQuinn Allen comes in, all his job is to pass pro. And so that's element's not there. It's hard to answer it before the draft, probably until we see what an NFL team sees and what kind of role they project Jadarian Price to fall into. Because you're exactly right. There's a reason why it wasn't there, but it wasn't there. And so to look at the numbers, bottom line flat out, it's not, that box is not checked. And so you could watch the film and look for, at some level, I think the danger that you run into is you basically approach the film looking for an answer. And when you come into it looking for what the answer might be, you probably have an answer that you think it's going to be, and you start to see the things that back up that view on it. If it's coming to it as, I like this player, but he's missing this, I want to find it, you're going to look until you find it in his game. Or if it's the other view, I don't see it in his game, you're going to pull the examples that kind of back that up. And so I feel like that's not a non-answer, but at the same time.
No, I mean, I think it comes down to basically what you're saying, and what it comes down to is it's just like there's a big projection that goes on with Jadarian Price. Like when you don't see something, we can't assume that it doesn't exist, right? But it does make the profile a lot more volatile, right? I do think that that's part of the prospecting process in general that kind of gets misunderstood, in my opinion, where you're pointing out red flags. Those red flags, to me, you could call them just like, it's just variance, right? Like it's pointing out where there might be volatility in a profile. It doesn't mean that it can't exist. We're not talking wide receivers here, but I've been bringing up Zach Branch so much, on this show because his deployment was ridiculous. Like in terms of seeing all this like manufactured stuff, a lot of screen work, just not a real route tree. And so that's a real big concern because you have to at least question, hey, are they deploying him that way because that's just the way the offense ran? Or are they deploying it that way because he can't do the other things? And it's not that we have an answer to that question. It's that we don't have the answer. And that makes the profile a lot more volatile and red flaggy. And that's kind of how I feel about Jadarian Price, where we're sitting here and we're saying like, yeah, he might have a decent pass catching profile in the NFL, or he might have this, or he might have that. When all of those stack up, it becomes everything that we do is going to be cost focused, right? So like any player is a value at some point and vice versa. But with Price, I think my fear is if he's the locked in RB2 post draft or in draft, like he goes early round 2 or something like that, mid round 2, then all of a sudden his rookie ADP is mid first round. Or something along those lines. And when you have a prospect that you're forecasting and having to project so much for, that just becomes a really, really highly volatile thing to do. And I'm not saying it's automatically going to go south. I'm just saying it's a risky thing to invest in overall.
And I think some level, what we're seeing with Jadarian Price is the lack of a clear running back 2 in this class, and looking at it as it's more the mystery box approach. It's like, I don't think it's these options. Maybe it's this option. And I think that's probably where it comes down to with Price. I do think that in prospecting, looking for what a player can do relative to like what they can't do, I think is probably one approach that I think over time wins out, and looking for the positives in the profile. But at some level, I think the people that are very, very high on Jadarian Price, it is that mystery box of it. It's I've gone through everything else. I haven't seen what I want to see through anything else. I can say maybe if Jadarian Price was at Alabama or something else, he would be the clear number 2 in this class. The lack of a clear number 2 in this class makes him my number 2. Yeah. So he's not my number 2, but it's just No, I think that happens.
That's a good point. This is one of the rare instances where a profile like this could be the second best running back in the class, like from a ranking perspective. Not to say that it would end up that way, just because there's just not a lot going on outside of, I think the class will probably have some guys who emerge, and it's probably overstated how bad it is or whatever. It's just the way that we get things wrong generally. But yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, that the class is just weak. And so taking on that volatility, sure. I mean, if you really need running back, or if you really want to go the running back route, then that's the opportunity that kind of is presenting itself at this point. Another running back who's sort of shooting up draft boards right now after the combine is Mike Washington. Do you agree or disagree that Mike Washington should be a day 2 pick? Because that obviously has a lot of weight to it for how you would view him as a prospect and how you would view him from a fantasy football perspective.
So I've already talked about, I was deep on the wide receivers, and I spent a lot of January, February doing the wide receivers for the Football Guys Rookie Guide. And then when I plugged into running backs, Dave Kluge, my co-host on the Dynasty Show, good friend at Football Guys, he did the running backs. And when I plugged into the running backs, obviously I knew Jeremiyah Love was going to be the top back in this class. I kind of looked at it, and it's like the Jadarian Price number 2 argument. I was like, well, wait a minute. We've got Mike Washington here, who's 230 pounds and potentially runs a 4.3. Why are we not just making him the running back 2 in the class, given that the size speed factor of it all is just a rare profile? Now, so is not doing anything until his 5th year of college is a rare profile as well. And so there's definitely risk involved in it, but I did have him as my running back 2, really just kind of having the argument of the things that I know, the things that I can see here of him being this rare size speed blend. And I think the receiving profile, there were some things on tape that he made plays on the ball down the field, and probably that's where I'm looking at some level on the receiving side of it. I don't want to see just the schemed up screen, get the ball in the hands behind the line of scrimmage type thing. I want to see if a guy can actually play the ball downfield. And I think Washington had some of that on his tape. And when you have the size, speed, plus some of that in the lack of the argument for Jadarian Price, essentially, the lack of a clear running back 2 in the class, you look at the overall upside and say, if this guy were to hit the upside case on him, he's got pretty high ceiling if it were to get all there. And so I had him as my running back 2 prior to the combine. Obviously that performance, I mean, we go from, hey, this guy looks pretty fast on film, I see this thing that he's doing against Texas's defense, who I know is pretty good, to what he laid out in that performance there kind of checks that box definitively. So I think it is overall just the conversation. And then part of it too, we're 2 years removed from a class that we didn't think was very good at running back, and it turns out that class was not very good at running back. And they're, even the guys the Trey Benson and the Jonathan Brooks, obviously injuries for both of them, but we haven't gotten that out of there. And so the reality of it is I think a lot of times what we do in fantasy football is assume that the answer has to be something and not realize the answer can be nothing.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make, especially as we think about where these guys will fall from a draft capital perspective. I thought Jax Falcone, who was on the show on Perspectives a few weeks ago, when he was mentioning, I love that we just call him Jax Falcone, even though it's just but he was on the show and he mentioned that he's not going to, at that time, and to be fair, obviously things can change, but he mentioned that he's not going to draft, he's not going to put any running back in the first round of rookie drafts. He's just not going to do it because there's not. And it's you can do that. You're free to do that and to not force the issue. Whereas you look at ADP and rookie draft ADP right now, if you look at Keep Trade Cut or something like that, it is kind of crazy to me that there is seemingly a confidence of some of these guys that could easily go day 3 being drafted over potential first round wide receivers, and it's, to me, that's really what these rookie drafts are probably going to come down to this year is, yes, we know running back can get you that immediate production. And yes, we know that high end running backs are always the cheat code in fantasy football. They give you the biggest edge in fantasy football. But at the same time, it's just, to me, it's just a safer bet and probably not great. It's probably better process to be going after the pretty good wide receivers, not even saying that they have to be elite, but like pretty good first round wide receivers over a guy that right now is questionable to even go day 2 in the draft. And we could walk away from the NFL draft this year, Jeff, with like just Jadarian Price as a running back pick. Like it's a very possible outcome. And it just seems like, I don't know. I think that sometimes we get a little bit too confident with like how many day 2 backs there are going to be, or like who's going to be locked into these areas. And we just don't know for sure. And if you're drafting pre-draft, which hopefully, I don't think many people do and will, but when that's the case, I would definitely be leaning more wide receivers. Why my rankings lean more wide receiver heavy, because we at least have confidence in where these guys are going to go. And from a draft capital perspective. But yeah, I mean, like you said, we shouldn't just assume that someone's going to hit, because it might not happen. Yeah. It really might not happen, especially in a class like this.
We're a year removed from Caleb Johnson. Was like everybody's taking him in the first round, and then was selecting. Even we saw in the draft, we saw him fall almost out of day 2, and people were still taking him over Tyler Warren and Colston Loveland, who tight ends that went top 10, top 15 in the draft, and there was really no reason to, other than we just started doing it. So we kept doing it. And I think that we do see that a lot in fantasy, that we start doing something with a kind of an assumption or not a lot of basis behind starting doing that. And then we just kind of, I think the ADP is a fascinating concept in general, because at some point ADP is set for the year somewhat arbitrarily, and then we just kind of enforce on ourselves over and over again. Especially the best ball, I feel like really does it, where the beginning ADP for best ball is somewhat arbitrary to some level, and then it's set, and then it's just reinforced upon itself. And it's like, well, I mean, thousands of drafts have been done with this guy going at this spot in ADP, so you have to take him in the spot in ADP. But why did they get there in the first place? And so I think it's just kind of in general, I absolutely agree with you that it doesn't have to be one of these running backs, and to pass up wide receivers that we feel really, really good about being first round picks. I'm not going to go there. I'm going to take the wide receiver, but I know we did a show last spring with a first round wide receiver and talk about Matthew Golden. And I was talking about how I'm taking him at the 112 or 201, whatever it might be in a lot of drafts. That hasn't worked so far. And there's arguments in cases of any direction that you really kind of want to pick.
Yeah. I mean, this isn't to say that like anyone's right or wrong, or that, what I'm merely saying that I think that there's a difference between, a guy that could go round 5, like realistically, like Mike Washington could go round 5. Like that's not out of the question, even like Caleb Johnson, like at least he still went day 2, but here we're talking a player who could quite literally fall a lot further than people would imagine. And there's just no reason, in my opinion, at this point to not only that, but it's a running back. Cause like, again, let's just use the Caleb Johnson, cause I think it's a great example, but the Caleb Johnson thing, it's like, he had interesting marks that, a lot of people were like really high on him. I just don't know if anyone's like pounding the table saying Mike Washington is a really, really good like, I think Caleb Johnson in this draft class is the RB2 from a prospecting standpoint. I understand some people, didn't like him, and you're right. Like he was, he's clearly not the guy. Like if you didn't like Caleb Johnson, then kudos. That was a good process. But I think that he would probably be looked at more favorably than Mike Washington, right, at this point. Yeah. And so that's where it's just such a weird sort of dynamic in class at this point. In time. But let's move on to Emtt Johnson, because he has a really great production profile, but the athleticism is a little bit questionable. Didn't test like extraordinarily well. I like Emtt Johnson a lot, but I want to hear other perspectives here. So how do you feel about Emtt Johnson?
Yeah, and I know in the show notes you put down that he had a weaker combine, and when it came to testing numbers, sure, but I think it's the takeaway on Emtt Johnson, I think, at the combine, when you look at what the combine has become, is basically like to go from talking about Mike Washington to Emtt Johnson at the combine. You're talking about two opposite ends of the coin, essentially, at the combine, of what the view should be on the combine, because Mike Washington basically said, this is my size. I'm going to run a 40. He lays down his 4.3 40, and he said, peace, I'm out. See you later. I did the one thing, whereas things didn't go good for Emtt Johnson, but he kept doing it, and he ended up being the only running back that did all the drills. And I think that there's something to be said for that when you're looking at the foundational level of the piece that's so hard in prospecting of what are these players made of. And I think a lot of it, they're going to come down to, you have a lot of these guys that you just think about growth and maturity, human life cycle in general. A lot of these guys were 5-star recruits, and then they land at big schools and they blow up and they don't really get challenged to some level, and to end up in really arguably what could be the lowest moment of his life. The fact that he came back the next day and still just kept doing things, I think says a ton about Emtt Johnson. And when, from the production standpoint, yeah, great production his final season at Nebraska. But when it comes down to it, he didn't have the testing that you want to see, but it feels like more often than not, the guys that do blow up the combine and testing are the ones that end up not doing anything. It's the guys that have worked their way into being more. And I think it's just fascinating, just in general, of looking at athletes at this age, just what they're going to go through. They're going to be, a lot of these guys are going to be struggling more than they've ever struggled in their entire life. And we just come off of Caleb Johnson and having that fumble in week 2 that really kind of defined his entire season. And at some point, unless he bounces back, could define his entire career at some level. One mistake. I think seeing Emtt Johnson, knowing that he kept plugging away, essentially, I think kind of answers some questions that you might have about the actual performance there. And the production profile is very strong, like you said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, his receiving profile, I think, is the best in this class. Like, it's just, I mean, you can throw out like a Eli Heidenreich, and let's not consider him a running back, just given, the type of player he is. But I mean, I also think that from a combine perspective, people listen to this show will probably think that I'm weighing the combine, X, but I'm actually weighing it like X divided by 3. It's just not nearly as much as people probably would assume, like what speed score matters and stuff. And then the other point to that too, is that like, you usually are going to be looking at more of the extremes with testing and with athleticism and whatnot. And I don't think Emtt Johnson hit an extreme, the way that he tested, which makes me feel better about him as a prospect. He's my RB2 right now. We'll see what happens with draft capital, because I do think that's really up in the air, both with him. It's similar to Mike Washington. We just don't really know. Whereas I feel most confident that Jadarian Price would be going day 2, of this group, just given what mock drafts are saying and such. But it just goes back to the exact conversation we were just having about, how do we possibly rank some of these guys pre-draft when we just have zero clue who's going to get the capital and not. One guy who seems to be falling down mock draft boards is Jonah Coleman, who didn't do any testing at the combine. He has a really, Doug Martin-y, rest in peace type build to him, a good production profile. But do you see him as someone who should be slipping into day 3, or do you think that he could be a day 2 back?
Man, I think that when it comes down to, especially when it comes down to day 2, what we see more often than not, NFL teams are willing to take a bet on the freak athlete, essentially, as opposed to kind of the production. And we see a lot more. It's a lot more transparent with wide receivers. And what we see, NFL teams are going to bet on the 6'3" wide receiver that tested out of the gym and might not have done anything at the college level in production before they're going to take a bet on the Xavier Restrepo of the class, basically. Sure. And that's kind of, I think that's probably the argument for Mike Washington as you stack it up. That might be viewed as the argument against Jonah Coleman. I mean, it's at this point, it does feel shaky to have a definitive stance on any of these backs going day 2, because we run into how is the league going to value the running back position is probably part of it. You've got, really feels like we have 2 opposite ends of the spectrum, and we see it play out more often than not, where we're projecting these teams, like they throw a Seattle out there as a great landing spot. And because we don't see good running backs there right now, and then it comes to the draft and we get, to go to Seattle, you have Kenneth Walker coming off a very strong rookie season. They draft Zach Charbonnet because that regime at that time valued the running back position. And it becomes the point of, while everybody else is devaluing the running back position, they become the best player on our board. So while it's filled for us already, it's filled because we value the running back position. We devalue it here in the draft, but we still value it more than the other teams. So we're going to take another one. I think that that's what you run into probably on the conversation with running back. I think Jonah Coleman, there's a case to be made that he checks those boxes as a 3-down back, and he's done that in the past. But the athleticism, similar to Emtt Johnson, is the athleticism there to make a team comfortable with one of those premium picks when they're wanting to spend them on the size speed freak guy in hopes that they can figure out the reasons why he wasn't super productive, because it's really hard to teach the size speed freak aspect of it.
Yeah. Makes sense. And then we have the Penn State backfield, Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen. Do you have a favorite between the two of them?
Well, I mean, my head feels like Kaytron Allen's the type of player that is going to figure it out. My heart, maybe I've flipped those two around, but Nick Singleton to me feels like the bet that NFL teams make over and over again, because we know he's number one running back in the class. When you're looking at the two of them, overall explosion, Singleton has that in spades. It's the interesting thing between the two of them. We talk about the mental makeup, the heart of Emtt Johnson, what he went through. That Penn State season, everything went off the rails, and it's really similar to the Ollie Gordon conversation at some level. I think of Oklahoma State, Ollie Gordon coming out and being, you look 2 years ago, he would have been one of the top, maybe the top back in that weak class. Comes back, has a terrible season because this team started to lose, and probably at some level he said, I really wish I would have been able to go to the NFL. I think with Singleton, everything around him seems to be the case of everybody came back to Penn State because they lost in the semifinals. They thought they would be a college football playoff team. The season goes off the rails very hard, and Nick Singleton checked out, and Kaytron Allen decided he's going to become the all-time leading rusher at Penn State. And so that says something about both of them, but still the reason why Singleton's been the Devy running back in the class in the past was the number one recruit in the class, because he does check those size speed skill freak factors in spades over what you see from Kaytron Allen.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think Singleton, and I've said this on shows, and I'll say it again later in the week when Perspectives comes out, but I think Singleton is one of those players where on paper he looks the part, it's all there. But then, I had Derek Brown on the show, and it was funny because one of Nick Singleton's main comps that came out on the ZAP model was CJ Procise, and that was the comp that Debro had for Nick Singleton, which is hilarious because it's such a niche kind of comp to make, right? But that is the fear, I think, with Singleton, is that everything is there, but it's not quite there, right? He has the athleticism, he has the production profile, but something is just kind of missing where he's not able to be the great fantasy asset that we want him to be. But again, in this kind of class, man, like we've been saying, shooting for upside makes a lot of sense. And I do think Singleton has a lot of that. Pretty good receiving profile for a guy his size too. All right. Of all the backs we haven't talked about, are there any that you have as a favorite that you might see as a value this year?
I think that, I don't think he's going to be drafted, but I think Seth McGowan is fascinating in terms of looking at a former blue chip, the things that NFL teams value, blue chip recruits, and then everything goes off the rails for him. He has to climb the path back, and had a really, really strong season last year. I think Adam Randall is really fascinating in terms of converted wide receiver that becomes the running back. And you look at, talk about again, size, speed, freak potential that has receiving potential, given since he was a wide receiver, that becomes interesting there. In some level, it's difficult to do pre-draft because we're just some of the deep running backs that you like are the guys that land, like the Ja'Cory Krosky-Merritt is the last back off the board, but he lands in a Washington backfield that they decided they didn't like Brian Robinson anymore, and he ends up as the back there. It's kind of, I think wide receiver is interesting to dive into on looking at archetypes and looking at what potential hits could be there versus like a Dante Thornton. Like the path for Dante Thornton to be fantasy relevant is very extremely narrow relative to what NFL other receivers can bring to the table. Running back is kind of like, I hate to say like a cockroach, but like what's going to be alive basically after the nuke goes off and nothing is left in this backfield. Well, this guy is left standing more often than not. When we get into the season, get into December, those are the backs that basically there was no other option to go here.
Yeah. I've done some research that with day 3 backs, the ones who end up emerging typically are ones who are in those ambiguous backfields where you can just look at redraft ADP, and if their teammates are drafted late, then those are the backs that you might want to think about and target, even in Dynasty, just because you can get that value jump, from one year to the next. Jeff, this was great, man. Really appreciate your time and having, and jumping on and talking running backs. Let everyone know what you're working on, where they can find you and all that good stuff.
Yeah, everything's coming out through Football Guys, and I've got the Dynasty show going on with Football Guys. Now we're going to be on version 3 of our rookie guide. We've done version 2. We do version 1 right around the Super Bowl. We do version 2 coming out of the combine. Start to paint the picture a little bit of what these profiles put together and what prospects we're dealing with. And then version 3 comes out after the NFL draft. That's a big one. I've got an NFL mock draft, my mock draft 1.0 late in the process for 1.0, but I've been a little bit busy. Is going to be coming out tomorrow, so that is in the works as well. So that's really kind of, and I'm doing a lot of taxes right now. So that's what I've been up to, and daddying around. You know how that is.
Yeah. I mean, this is middle of tax season. I didn't even think about it whenever I DM'd you about the show, and then I felt guilty because you have 2 weeks left until that turnover day for you. But thank you for your time. I greatly appreciate it. As always, guys, check out lateround.com. Make sure you're checking out the prospect guide. You will get the post-draft version of that guide just hours after the NFL draft if you get the pre-draft version. So you'll get both versions of that. Otherwise, everyone, I got perspectives later in the week. As a reminder, I'm not around for the show on Wednesday with David Kitchen, but later in the week, you will get a late round perspectives episode. So I'll talk to you then.
Hey, it's Haley Steinfeld. When everything requires your attention, it can be tough to figure out what to prioritize. But I'm here to talk to you about something that you should always put first, your breast health. In fact, if you're 40 and over, you should be getting screened once a year. And if you're under 40, it's never too soon to visit yourattentionplease.com to learn about your breast cancer risk. So go on, pay the girls some attention and take the time to find out your breast cancer risk at yourattentionplease.com. Trust me, your future self will thank you.
I'm Daniel Jeremiyah.
And I am Greg Rosenthal.
I know that, Greg. We're teaming up on 40s and Free Agents, the podcast that owns the NFL offseason.
This is where teams are built. Free agency, the combine, pro days, trades. Every move matters.
From my draft boards and mock drafts
to my vaunted top 101 free agents and how rosters come together.
Quarterback movement,
surprise signings.
We'll tell you what it means and who really wins. Open your free iHeartRadio app, search 40s and Free Agents, and listen now.
This is an iHeart podcast. Guaranteed human.